Good day, everybody. This is Yin Yang, 4 minutes late, and I am here with Morsels of a Thought, number 1864. This is how many times I've come to you with morsels of a thought. Hopefully, that those morsels are thoughts of wisdom. Hopefully, that wisdom becomes virtue by means of our own actions. So, right now, I am reading from you the estimable Larry J. Namer's book titled Off Script. Can you see that word at all? Off script. There you go. You might even see reflections of my kitchen. And I am here going to read to you what he said when we started that chapter on From Russia with Love. Now we're on chapter 13, the Soviet Union, St. Pete, and Santa Barbara. Never follow the crowd. Off script. Never follow the crowd. Recipes for success. Now, I have got a couple of recipes in his back of his book that he's got. They are so good looking. And I see him. He's got an internet presence, and he puts his food on there when he makes it. And it's got to be good because I've seen the ingredients and I've seen the methods. And my dad was a restaurant cook in New York at some time in his day. And I've heard of a few secrets to cooking. I have heard of a few secrets to certain places. Showbiz, cooking, retail, cinema. What do they call it? Beauty queen stuff? No, I was never in one, but my sister was. Well, she was the one who said she didn't have any brothers and sisters, actually, because technically she was a stepsister. So, okay, you know. Anyway, page 72. When Yeltsin wanted to preempt the show one night so he could give a political address, the people literally threatened to burn down the White House. Even to this day, when I meet Russians anywhere in the world, they remember watching the show with their families, and it's the show that they had that the that Larry J. Namer did that was called. Yay. I read it here somewhere the other day. Anyway, it was a show. Dallas storyline. Who could fight? Yay. Anyway, they watched something else. And the reason I'm looking over here is that, we were at this. Okay, while Russia was undergoing so many changes, Santa Barbara changed my life in Russia. For one thing, all of the mob guys had girlfriends who were avid fans of the show. Of course, they knew who I was. It was pretty obvious I was the Hollywood guy who lived at the dacha. I could be sitting in a restaurant when one would walk up to me and ask me to, quote, tell me what happens to Mason in next week's episode so I can impress my girlfriend or wife. When I would first say I can't divulge that kind of information, they would make me an offer I couldn't refuse. Not in Godfather terms. Like, if you tell me we know where to get fresh tomatoes and we will bring them to you. I told, and every week a delivery of fresh produce would miraculously show up at the dacha. Then there was the time that I thought I would have a heart attack. The main guys who ran St. Petersburg and beyond knew me, and I knew them. You could say that we had a friendly relationship of sorts. I was not seen as the American carpetbagger who came to Russia to make a quick buck. Rather, I was seen as someone who had an interest in helping the people of the city I came to love, and they didn't believe that profit was my only motive. At the time, the city bosses had enormous power and were known to be very brutal to defend their turf. One time when I flew into St. Pete, cars drove up to the plane, which I found odd. Generally, back then, planes parked on the runway, and buses would take the passengers to the terminals. But this was different. I came down the stairway to a half a dozen guys who were looking at something and talking to each other. To my surprise, the thing they were looking at was my picture. "Are you Larry Namer?" they asked. I said yes, but in a very nervous way. In response, they told me to get in the car. They drove me back to the terminal building and walked me to customs. The line was probably an hour long, but they went right to the front and told the customs officer, "He is with us." And we walked right through. Then they told me that their boss needed to see me at 8 p.m. that night at the Astoria Hotel. To say I was nervous would be an understatement, and for good reason. The boss was known to be a very dangerous guy. I couldn't imagine what he wanted from me, but my imagination came up with some pretty terrifying possibilities. Someone who worked for me insulted him, and they wanted me to kill that person. They had a spat with the mayor, and know I'm having dinner with him, and they are going to plant a gun for me to find and shoot him. This came from the scene in The Godfather, where Michael shoots the enemy of his father and the crooked cop. I was beyond nervous the more I thought about why he could possibly want to see me. I was waiting outside the hotel when a parade of cars drove up. First came the big guys in Armani suits with pistols clearly bulging. Then the boss followed. He spoke a little English and I spoke a little Russian, but one of his folks spoke both fairly well and facilitated the exchange. The boss put his arm around my shoulders and started walking into the hotel with me in tow. He was very strong. "We need to talk," he said. I wasn't about to argue, but I thought my legs would give out. Then he said, "I'm embarrassed to ask this, but I need a favor." "You name it, you got it," I somehow managed to reply, thinking this might be what I needed to say to spare my life. He repeated that he was embarrassed to ask for this favor, but he must. Then he continued, "I heard that at your concert tomorrow night, you have the actor who plays Mason in Santa Barbara coming in as a special guest. My mother is in the sh- my mother is the show's biggest fan, and I would be very grateful if there was some way you could introduce her to Mason," played by actor Lane Davies. I almost collapsed in relief, but somehow found my bearings and said, "Sure, bring mom to the back door of the concert hall at 8 p.m and I'll take her to the VIP room and introduce her to Lane." When I saw Lane, I told him I was going to introduce him to the prettiest woman he'd ever met, and he needed to be especially nice and gracious. He thought I was nuts, and I don't blame him, but I told him that he didn't want to know the story. Just do as I say. The next night, they showed up as scheduled, and I walked them both up to the VIP room. She was a very nice little Russian lady who was also a school official. Now, I should mention that my security at the concert and in the VIP room were all well trained Russian security forces and police. When they saw who came into the room with me, they immediately left. I thought
I brought his mom over to Lane and he hugged her as the photographers took pictures. The boss stood against the back wall with arms folded and a blank look on his face, so I couldn't tell what he was thinking. Then the mom presented Lane with a special proclamation that was created by some students and told him that he had brought such joy into so many lives. When it was all over, I walked her back to her son, who just looked at me and said, "You made my mother very happy. I never forget." From that day forward, my life in St. Petersburg changed dramatically. It seems he sent my picture with his folks to every restaurant and nightclub in town and introduced the folks who ran those places that it mattered if I was drunk at 3 a.m. and walking alone with $100 bill taped to my forehead, they were responsible for getting me home safely. If I as much as hit a bump in a taxi, they would have to answer to the boss. No matter where I went, people would come up and ask me if everything was okay and if there was anything they could do for me. I was at a restaurant with my friend Michael from the US, and some of the boys came up and asked if everything was okay. They even told us not to worry about paying for the meal. Everything was taken care of. Michael asked where we could go to find girls, as he pointed to a few sitting at a table with their boyfriends or husbands, saying we wanted to go somewhere to find girls like that. They went to the table and had a discussion with the people, and it was clearly obvious that the guys with the girls were not happy. And who could blame them? It seems they told the girls that they needed to leave these guys and come to our table. The girls were locals and understood this was not a simple ask, but rather an order. On the contrary, the guys were not locals and they kept arguing and objecting. When we were leaving the place to go to a nightclub with the girls, the guys followed, but so did the St. Pete boys. A fight broke out, the bloodiest beating I ever witnessed. I could literally hear bones cracking. Those poor guys were on the receiving end of what I had feared was going to happen to me when I was approached by the St. Pete boys. But somehow, in a strange twist of fate, they were beating the pulp out of other people in order to take care of me. And I have to tell you that the boss kept his promise. It was like that everywhere I went. I had my own personal security guards, and the St. Pete boys made sure I got whatever I wanted, no matter what. Oh boy. The beauty of it all, chapter 14. St. Petersburg was still Leningrad when I first started going there during the Soviet days. When it changed its name back to St. Petersburg, someone thought it would be a good idea to have a beauty contest. Miss St. Petersburg. To me, this was comical. After all, I grew up during the Cold War, and all I knew about Russia was our own propaganda. The commercials on TV depicted Russian women in a different light as big women in bathing suits pulling plows. So that's what I envisioned Russian women to be, strong like ox. Boy, was I wrong. What I saw in real life were some of the most beautiful women I've ever seen. That was true for more than Russia. You couldn't walk down the street in the former Soviet republics or Eastern Europe without falling in love. I was asked to be a judge in that first beauty contest, and of course, I agreed. It was interesting. For one thing, the host was dressed as Peter the Great, and the entertainment was a dancing bear. Okay, they hadn't done this sort of thing in a while, so I guess this was a good first attempt. Now, when we got to the judging, that was a whole new experience for me. As Dorothy said in The Wizard of Oz, we are not in Kansas anymore. We're not in Kansas anymore. I was diligently reviewing the pictures and information about all the contestants when a few guys with twisted noses walked over to me and showed me a picture of one contestant. "This is the winner," they said, and who was I to argue? The next year, the organizers wanted to raise the bar and asked me to be bring supermodel Claudia Schiffer to be a judge. When we did as asked, and she was a judge. The following year, it was Linda Evangelista, and the next year, it was Wonderbra girl Eva Herzegova. Through it all, I was liking Russia more and more. After my breakup with Natalie, a friend in LA introduced me to a model from the Ukraine who is one of the faces of L'Oreal for Eastern Europe. She was by far the most beautiful person inside and out I have ever met. We lived together for a year, and she was amazing in so many ways. She couldn't understand why I had a maid come in to clean the house when she could do it herself. She didn't do drugs, and as beautiful as she was, she had no ego. She was just a sweet, warm, wonderful person who was so happy to be out of the Ukraine and living in LA. Even my mother liked her, saying she was the first woman I was with who called her mom. Unfortunately, she needed to get married in order to stay here, and I was not ready to get married. So we parted, and a matchmaker connected her to a tech millionaire who was thrilled to have a bride like her. He moved her out of LA for fear she would reconnect with me or someone else and would be influenced by her friends, most from Russia or Eastern Europe. Living in isolation in Northern California, she became depressed and was prescribed antidepressants. She had a daughter and seemed to be suffering from postpartum depression on top of it. The daughter was 3 when I got a call from Diane, the matchmaker who connected her to her husband, who informed me Tatiana had died in her sleep. She said it was a reaction to the pills and wine, but I never found out more. To this day, I want to kick myself in the butt for not marrying her. I never met anyone like her and doubt I ever will. You could say she is the one who got away, and I'm the one who let her go. And then chapter 15, the China years. It's unbelievable, but this college graduate who wanted to be a teacher went from Coney Island to Los Angeles. Yes, it was a bit of a culture shock. Naturally, that shock intensified when I went to the Soviet Union and, to my surprise, later in China. One thing I did in Russia was help the Minister of Communications write the new policies for governing television and media in general. Michael Lessin was the minister, but before that, he was the head of Video International, the company we worked with to bring Santa Barbara to Russia. The Russians realized that to build a consumer economy, they would have to make advertising media somewhat familiar to Western marketers. I helped with that, and when the Chinese came to that same conclusion, they went to the Russians who sent them to me. We started in China with the low hanging fruit. Our first show was called Hello Hollywood, and because we didn't speak the language, we had a Mandarin speaking person in LA go to all the parties and premieres and interview the stars. At the time, the landscape in China's TV scene was beginning to change dramatically as they moved toward building a consumer economy. Each of the major regions in China had their own media group which ran multiple channels. For example, Beijing had BTV, Beijing TV, and Shanghai had SMG, Shanghai Media Group. For me, this started to feel very familiar, much like the early days of US cable, where certain media companies became the developers of multiple thematic channels. It stayed that way in China until the government passed new rules that allowed each regional media company to put one of their channels on satellite and distribute it all over the country. While satellite technology allowed the new signal to have a countrywide footprint, it still required each satellite channel to make a deal with another regional media company to carry that channel. This resembled how the channel business in the US rolled out, only it was a bit more orderly. When we started Movie Time, E, We put the signal on satellite, but then had to go from city to city to convince the local cable company to add us to their lineup. There were hundreds of important big companies and thousands of smaller rural companies, so I spent a great deal of my time on the road pitching cable operators. They were all different, but as you can imagine, they all seemed like deja vu to me. Even with the growth of satellite TV, it was quite a challenge to get on a national feed. This was all new to them, and there weren't a lot of sources where they could turn for data to support our pitches for getting programs on. But once again, drawing on my past life, we found an opportunity in the marketplace with something that was very common in the US, but not yet exploited in China: syndicated television. The local stations were now having to supplement the government provided funding by actually getting an audience that could be defined and measured. And then they had to sell advertising to brands looking to reach that audience. For the local station, it was especially difficult because they had to compete with the bigger national channels to get the best program, as well as the advertisers that wanted those audiences. So we decided to bring the concept of syndication to the market. We created the Hello Hollywood show at a production level worthy of national distribution, but we went to each of the local TV stations and got them to agree to carry the show in exchange for allowing us to sell national advertising. We ended up with over 40 stations signing on and had a reach of a few 100 million homes. Not too shabby. The next challenge was piracy, which at the time was rampant in the market. This media for profit world was all new, and there was not a body of law that effectively protected ownership like that, which exists in most of the world. The government was actually actively enacting laws in an attempt to stop piracy, but because they were new, the enforcement was yet to catch up. With Hello Hollywood, we soon found out that for as many stations that had signed a real license with us, there were pirate operations that were showing our show without any license at all. Rather than beat our heads against the wall trying to stop the piracy, we took a lesson from Abby Hoffman, who wrote Steal This Book, and we called the pirates, who were easy to find, and said that we would not report them to the government on one condition: they had to wait 2 days from when we first broadcast the episode before they offered it up, and they had to report to us the viewership numbers in a format we specified. This increased our viewership, which in turn we sold to advertisers and made money from the audience the pirates delivered. The pirates were happy to get a high quality show for free with just the simple task of staying out of legal trouble. For all of us, it was a win-win. Abby Hoffman is spelled Abbie Hoffman. Okay, so when we started Metan Global Entertainment, Metan, we built a strong team in a very deliberate way. Okay, so we will read this next week, and I will get a couple of recipes from the back and show you the pictures of them next time we read them. All right, so this has been Morsels of a Thought. I am bringing my Morsels of a Thought over to Substack in the future. So please look for me on Substack. I am Ying Yang on Substack, YingYang on Substack. Please look for me there, and also find me on YouTube, Ying Orange 99. Okay? Old Kinder Hook.